Mr. President, dear colleagues, each opportunity to speak from this podium is a humbling experience, knowing that every other country in the world listen to each other and try to discern and understand as where our common approaches and interests lie. Those of us who represent small countries have a sense that this forum is a place where large nations address the ills of the world, and we, smaller ones, are ought to adhere to issues and topics that are specific to us and to our region, as if addressing overarching global issues will be pretentious, and it is best left to those with the power to do something about it. Mr. President, this is my 10th year here today, and I risk breaking the rule. This year, as financial calamities have compounded political and natural disasters, it was so clear and obvious that although our common problems and challenges threatens us all equally, but affects us unevenly. Small nations with less in everything, diversity, resources, maneuverability, means and options, are at greater peril, greater susceptibility than those with bigger territory, larger population, and bigger potential. At the same time, the issues on this Assembly's agenda, such as peace and security, economic growth, sustainable development, human rights, disarmament, drugs, crimes, and international terrorism, no borders. And none of us can address these issues individually if we want to see effective solutions. The solution of these problems are in our common interest, and these are issues that affect the entire humanity. And because these problems cannot be solved within our borders, no one has the right or the luxury to abdicate responsibility for the consequences. Mr. President, when the speculative market drives the price of oil to $80, those too small to have significant reserves are the ones that are affected most. And big countries with big appetite for fuel sometimes do deals on energy matters that are not consistent with their politics. So do we, because energy security is not only a matter of global arithmetic, it's a matter of life and death. When climate change causes serious changes in environment, it doesn't take much for a prolonged drought or excessive rain to harm our agriculture and damage our economy, or for rising seashores to reach our cities. But we don't have the space, the diversity to cope and adapt. When it is news that there are no explosions in Iraq and daily calamities are regular, we in the small countries begin to sense that we are vulnerable and susceptible to the will and the capacity of international community, and first and foremost to their tolerance to distant violence and humiliation. When development is dependent on absence of bad weather, disease, and war, and when the capacity to ward off at least two of those three ills lie in the hands of those with the capacity to bring peace and heal, we in the small nations feel at risk and helplessness. When disarmament and arms control cease to be instrument for peace and security, and they become instead a means to score political dividends, we in small countries turn to our own means for our self-protection. In other words, we become part of the problem because the solution is not straightforward nor is visible. And finally, Mr. Chairman, when Darfur becomes shorthand for helplessness, we in the small corners of the world realize that power has substituted responsibility. The ubiquitous human rights language cannot and will not compensate for political will to act. Genocide must be prevented, not commemorated. Generation after generation, we find new places for appalling human tolerance for what it is, inhuman machinations, names for places of slaughter, mass killing, massacre, for those who belong to a segment, to ethnic group, to race or religion. For 100 years, it was for Armenians the desert of Deir Zor. For the next generation was Auschwitz. Later on, the killing fields of Cambodians. And more recently, Rwanda. If each one of these, together with genocide, evoke ignorance, helplessness, and wartime cover, Darfur today is synonymous with expediency, evasion, and simple non-convenience. Darfur is synonymous with shame. My appeal on behalf of the small countries is that the international community address these issues each in its own merit and for its own sake, and not as pieces of global power puzzle. When the tension between global powers rise, this leads to polarization, and in turn this leads to the decrease in the ability of a small nation's hard-earned politics of complementarity and balance. Our ability to be part of these processes diminishes. Mr. President, let me state the obvious. We count on the goodwill of the big powers in the international community so that they put their divergences aside, their differences aside, and try to address these issues collectively. And we also expect that they clearly understand that their power and influence does not make them immune from the consequences of these processes and problems that afflict us. Mr. President, last month, Armenia celebrated its 16th year of independence. During this period, we weathered sea changes which swept up us in regional and global processes which afflicts us in our daily lives. But we can only be proud of what we have accomplished during this period. Open and diverse economy, high growth, strong financial systems, and also improved elections, stronger public institutions, and a population that is increasingly aware of its right. This gives us the confidence and the determination to address the other ills that our society faces. Uneven growth, high poverty rates, low pays, and also to strengthen the human institutions and also deepen the experience of democracy. Mr. President, we've done all this under difficult circumstances where we still have a conflict to resolve with our neighbor, and when there are artificial limitations on Armenia's ability to act, and in the absence of regional cooperation. This year, Assembly's agenda includes the item on protracted conflicts. Putting all these conflicts in one pot is inherently flawed. Our own conflict, Nagorno-Karabakh, does not belong there. UN is not the place to address because that issue is being addressed within the OSCE. Additionally, Karabakh is not a frozen conflict. We are negotiating with Azerbaijan, and we're inching toward the resolution. Secondly, during this time, there has been an evolution of the process. We have a balanced, a solid document in our hands which addresses not only the core issue, but also the consequential issues, and the two together add up to a reasonable solution. Thirdly, at the core of our process lie the right of people for self-determination. Indeed, the people of Karabakh do not want anything more than what it is theirs. They want to live in peace and security on their own territory. In other words, they would like to exercise the very right that every single nation in this hall has exercised sometime during their history. Mr. President, speaking of conflict, we also follow very closely the events in Kosovo. We hear the international community loud and clear that Kosovo will not be a precedent for other conflicts. Although we do not attempt to make Kosovo a precedent to our conflict, because that contradicts our own principle that conflicts are all different, but at the same time we will not accept, understand the reverse logic that because Kosovo has given independence, other people cannot achieve self-determination. No one should tell us, Mr. President, that there is a quota for liberty and freedom. Mr. President, at the end of the day, the willingness, the understanding of small nations and their involvement in global processes cannot be a substitute what major powers with greater capacity and political will to act can. In this age of openness and inclusion, there's no room for old instruments of coercion and exclusion. Instead, we need new instruments of compromise and consensus so that we can achieve humanity's enduring goal to live in peace and prosperity. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Armenia. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Seyum Mesfin, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ethiopia.